If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have told you that my life was pretty steady. My wife, Rachel, and I had built what I thought was a solid, dependable life together. We met during our late 20s at a mutual friend's barbecue. She was wearing this bright yellow sundress and had a way of lighting up every conversation. It didn't take long for me to know she was the one. We got married a couple of years later and settled into a comfortable rhythm. We had 2 kids, Mia and Caleb, who filled our days with chaos and laughter in equal measure. I worked long hours in logistics, managing inventory and shipments, while Rachel stayed home to take care of the kids. It wasn't always easy: financial stress, sleepless nights with a teething baby, and the usual wear and tear of family life, but we managed. I'd always believed we were a team, navigating the ups and downs together. Rachel was the kind of person who brought warmth into a room. She loved planning family outings, hosting playdates for the kids, and decorating the house for every holiday. I used to joke that we were living in a year-round Pinterest board. Sure, we'd had our disagreements over the years. Money, discipline styles for the kids, the usual stuff, but nothing that felt insurmountable. In fact, I'd say we were a fairly typical family. Even when life got hectic, I always felt like Rachel and I had each other's backs. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was. At the time, there was no reason to question anything. Rachel didn't act distant, didn't change her routine, and didn't drop any hints that there was trouble brewing. I felt lucky, honestly, lucky to have a partner like her and 2 beautiful kids who made the hard days worth it. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. And this one hit me harder than I ever thought possible. Life carried on without much fanfare for a while, and I had no reason to suspect anything was amiss. Rachel was the same attentive, loving mother to Mia and Caleb, and our house remained the hub of noise and laughter it had always been. My days were mostly consumed by work, and while I wasn't always as present as I wanted to be, I tried to make up for it during weekends. One Saturday, I decided to tackle a few long-overdue chores around the house. The kids were at a friend's birthday party, and Rachel was out running errands. I started in the garage, then moved on to organizing some paperwork that had piled up in our little home office. While sorting through a box of old documents, I came across Caleb's birth certificate tucked into a manila envelope. It wasn't unusual. Rachel was meticulous about keeping important paperwork together. I pulled it out, mostly out of curiosity, to double-check a date for a form I was filling out. As I glanced at the certificate, something caught my eye. Beneath the section where the parents' names were listed, there was a faint but legible handwritten note scrawled on the edge of the page. It wasn't official, just a small personal detail jotted down, probably by the nurse or clerk who'd issued it. It read, "Father unknown." My first thought was that it must have been a mistake. I mean, how could that be? Caleb was my son. He had my stubbornness, Rachel's smile, and this habit of scrunching up his nose when he was thinking hard about something. A habit I had as a kid, too. I sat there for a moment, staring at the note like it might vanish if I blinked enough times. The words felt surreal, almost comical, as if they belonged to someone else's life. Maybe it was just an error, I told myself. Hospitals and paperwork, those things aren't immune to mix-ups. But something about it nagged at me. Rachel and I had been married for over 10 years, and Caleb had been born 6 years into our marriage. The timeline left no room for ambiguity, at least, that's what I thought. I stuffed the certificate back into the envelope and decided to push the thought aside. That should have been the end of it. But once doubt sneaks in, it has a way of taking root, growing into something you can't ignore. Over the next few days, I found myself replaying little moments in my head, small interactions and offhand comments from the past that hadn't seemed significant at the time. There was the way Rachel had seemed overly relieved when Caleb started resembling her side of the family as he got older. Or that one time at a family barbecue when Rachel's sister made a joke about mystery genes after Caleb aced his first spelling bee. It had been laughed off, dismissed as harmless teasing. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Now, though, those moments felt loaded with meaning. Then there were the gaps, those occasional afternoons when Rachel would say she was meeting a friend or taking some time for herself. I'd never doubted her before. I trusted her implicitly. But now, even the most mundane details of our life together felt like potential red flags. I tried to convince myself I was being ridiculous. Rachel and I had built a life together, raised two amazing kids, and weathered our share of storms. There was no reason to question any of that. And yet, the words on that certificate lingered in the back of my mind, no matter how hard I tried to shake them. Eventually, I decided to bring it up. Not in an accusatory way. I just wanted an explanation, some kind of reassurance that would put my mind at ease. I told myself that Rachel would laugh it off, explain it as a clerical error, and that'd be the end of it. But deep down, I knew this wasn't something that could be brushed aside so easily. When I finally worked up the courage to ask Rachel about it, the look on her face told me everything I needed to know. That evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I decided I couldn't keep the discovery to myself any longer. Rachel was curled up on the couch, reading one of her novels, while I sat nearby, pretending to watch something on the TV. My thoughts were too loud to focus on anything else. The weight of the birth certificate had been pressing on me all day. I knew I had to bring it up, but the words felt heavy, stuck in my throat. Finally, I asked her about it. My voice was calm, but my heart pounded in my chest, betraying the storm brewing inside me. Her initial reaction seemed innocent enough, a mix of curiosity and confusion, but something in her eyes shifted when I mentioned Caleb's birth certificate and the note I'd found. I explained what I'd seen, choosing my words carefully. At first, she didn't seem to understand where I was going with it, but as the meaning settled in, her expression changed. She set her book down, her movements slow and deliberate, as if stalling for time. There was a long pause between us, the kind that stretches on endlessly, thick with unspoken words. Then, quietly, she began to talk. Her voice was steady at first, but as she went on, it wavered, heavy with emotion. She told me about a mistake she'd made years ago, long before Caleb was born. It had been one night, something she hadn't planned and deeply regretted. Hearing her say those words felt like the ground beneath me had been ripped away. My mind raced as I tried to absorb what she was saying. She explained how she hadn't known for certain if Caleb was mine when she found out she was pregnant, but she convinced herself that it didn't matter. In her eyes, I was his father in every way that counted. Her voice cracked as she admitted how scared she'd been back then. Scared of losing me, of shattering the life we'd built together. She'd buried the truth, she said, hoping it would stay hidden, believing it was the best way to protect our family. But to me, it felt like a betrayal on so many levels. All these years, I'd been living a version of my life that wasn't entirely real. The woman I loved, the person I trusted most, had kept something monumental from me. I asked her why she hadn't told me the truth back then. Her answer came with tears streaming down her face. Fear. Fear of breaking our family apart, of losing the love and stability we'd worked so hard to build. She insisted that everything she'd done since that night had been for our family. For me, for Caleb, for Mia. As she spoke, I felt a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Anger at the deception, sadness for the years we'd lived in a kind of shadow, and confusion about what this revelation meant for us moving forward. I couldn't deny the bond one had with Caleb, nor the love I still felt for Rachel. But this truth had shaken the foundation of everything I thought I knew. Unable to sit still, I got up and paced the room. My mind was flooded with questions I didn't know how to answer. Had our marriage been built on a lie? Could I forgive her for keeping something like this from me? Rachel's voice grew more desperate as she tried to explain herself, but I could barely focus on her words anymore. The weight of it all was too much. I needed space to think, to process, to figure out what came next. Eventually, I walked out of the room, leaving Rachel alone with her tears. As I closed the door behind me, I felt like I was stepping into a void. Everything about my life felt uncertain now, and I wasn't sure how or if I could find solid ground again. That night, I hardly slept. I stayed in the guest room, lying awake with my thoughts racing in every direction. The quiet of the house felt oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I replayed Rachel's words over and over, trying to understand how we had reached this point. I had always thought our marriage was built on trust and honesty, and to realize there had been this hidden corner of our lives all along, it was devastating. My mind kept drifting to Caleb. Every memory of him, every moment I'd spent teaching him to ride a bike, reading him bedtime stories, or cheering him on at soccer games, now carried this strange, heavy weight. He was still my son. There was no doubt in my heart about that. But knowing there was a chance he wasn't biologically mine stirred up feelings I didn't even know I was capable of. By the time the sun came up, I felt like I hadn't made any progress in sorting through my emotions. I avoided Rachel that morning, staying out of the kitchen while she got the kids ready for school. I could hear her voice, gentle and cheerful, as though everything was normal. I envied her ability to keep it together for the sake of Mia and Caleb. When they finally left, I found myself standing in the middle of the living room, surrounded by silence. My mind was a storm, swirling with anger, sadness, and confusion. I didn't know what to do or where to start. Part of me wanted to confront her again, to demand answers to all the questions still rattling around in my head. But another part of me was afraid of what I might hear. I decided to go for a drive, hoping the open road would give me some clarity. I ended up at a park we used to visit when the kids were younger. I parked the car and sat on a bench overlooking the playground, watching other families enjoy their morning. Parents pushing kids on swings, toddlers chasing each other in the grass. It felt like a glimpse into a life that now seemed impossibly distant. As I sat there, I tried to make sense of my emotions. The anger I felt toward Rachel was sharp and unrelenting. How could she keep something like this from me for so long? But alongside that anger was a deep, aching sadness. I thought about the trust we'd shared, the life we'd built together. Was it all a lie? Or was this just one terrible decision in an otherwise solid relationship? I couldn't help but think about Caleb again. He didn't ask for any of this. He was just a kid who loved his dad, who looked up to me and depended on me. That thought hit me harder than anything else. Whatever Rachel had done, it didn't change the fact that I was his father in every way that mattered. I couldn't let my feelings toward her affect the way I treated him. By the time I got back home, the house was quiet. Rachel was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes puffy and red from crying. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The air between us felt heavy, like a chasm we didn't know how to cross. I sat down across from her, my movements slow and deliberate. I still didn't know what to say or where to start, but I knew we couldn't ignore this. Rachel broke the silence first, apologizing again, her voice trembling with emotion. She said she'd spent the night thinking about everything, about the choices she'd made and the pain she'd caused. She admitted that keeping the truth from me had been selfish, that she had let her fear of losing our family blind her to what was right. Her words hit me hard. It was clear she was remorseful, that she understood the gravity of what she had done. But understanding her regret didn't make it any easier to forgive her. I told her as much, my voice low but firm. I wasn't ready to talk about forgiveness, not yet. I asked her more about what had happened, about how she could keep such a monumental secret for so many years. She explained that at the time, she hadn't known how to handle the situation. She had been overwhelmed, scared, and unsure of what the right thing to do was. She admitted that every time she thought about telling me, the fear of losing me and breaking up our family kept her silent. Her words were raw, and I could see the pain in her eyes, but they didn't erase the hurt I felt. I told her I needed time, that I couldn't just move past this overnight. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and said she understood. She said she would do whatever it took to make things right, to rebuild the trust she had broken. I didn't know what making it right even looked like. Could trust like this ever be rebuilt? I had no answers, only more questions. But I did know one thing. I wasn't going to let this tear apart my relationship with Caleb. Whatever happened between Rachel and me, he was my son, and I would always be there for him. For the rest of the day, we avoided each other, moving through the house like strangers. The silence was deafening, but it gave me space to think. I realized that this wasn't something I could handle on my own. I needed help, someone to talk to, someone who could help me sort through the mess of emotions I was dealing with. That night, as I lay in bed, I made a decision. I wasn't ready to give up on my family, but I also wasn't ready to forgive Rachel. I needed time, space, and guidance to figure out what came next. And I hoped, deep down, that we could find a way forward, even if I couldn't see it yet. The days that followed felt like a blur of routines and restless thoughts. I went to work, I came home, and I spent as much time as I could with Mia and Caleb. I clung to the familiarity of those moments, as though they could somehow ground me in the storm I was living through. Rachel and I barely spoke unless it was about the kids or something practical, and even then, our conversations were strained and cautious. But as much as I tried to focus on the present, one thought kept gnawing at me. I needed to know the truth about Caleb. It wasn't that I doubted my love for him. Nothing could change the bond we'd built over the years, but I couldn't move forward without clarity. It was like trying to walk through quicksand. Every step felt uncertain and heavy. After wrestling with the decision for days, I finally took action. I ordered a paternity test online, something discreet and straightforward. The kit arrived a few days later, and I remember staring at the box for what felt like hours before I finally opened it. The instructions were simple enough. Swab my cheek, collect a sample from Caleb, and mail it back. Getting Caleb's sample was the hardest part. I waited until Rachel was out of the house, and I told Caleb it was for a health check. He didn't question it. Why would he? He trusted me completely, and the weight of that trust made the whole process feel even heavier. I kept telling myself this wasn't about him. It was about finding answers, about figuring out how to deal with everything that had happened. The days after I mailed the test were some of the longest of my life. Every time my phone buzzed or my email dinged, my heart would race, only to sink when it wasn't the results. I didn't tell Rachel about the test. Part of me felt guilty for keeping it from her, but I needed to do this on my own. I wasn't ready to have that conversation with her, not until I knew the truth. When the results finally came in, I was sitting in my car outside work. I opened the email with trembling hands, my stomach churning with a mix of fear and anticipation. As my eyes scanned the page, I felt the world around me slow to a crawl. The results were clear. Caleb wasn't biologically mine. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was as though the air had been sucked out of the car, leaving me in a vacuum of disbelief and pain. I read the results again and again, hoping I had misinterpreted them, but the words didn't change. The truth was staring me in the face, undeniable and irreversible. Tears blurred my vision. The confirmation hit me like a tidal wave, bringing with it a flood of emotions I couldn't contain. There was anger, at Rachel, at the situation, at the unfairness of it all. There was sadness, deep and aching, for the loss of the certainty I had always carried about my role in Caleb's life. And then there was fear of what this would mean for our family, for my relationship with the boy I had raised as my own. But amid all the chaos in my mind, one thought stood out like a beacon. Caleb didn't know any of this. To him, I was his dad, the person he looked up to and relied on. That hadn't changed. I knew in my heart that I couldn't let these results define my relationship with him. He was my son, in every way that mattered, and I wasn't going to let a piece of paper take that away from us. When I got home that evening, Rachel was in the kitchen, cooking dinner while the kids played in the living room. She glanced at me as I walked in, her expression cautious, as though she could sense the weight I was carrying. I avoided her gaze and went straight to the guest room, closing the door behind me. I needed time to process what I had learned before I could face her, or anyone else. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about what came next. The truth was out now, at least for me, and it felt like a Pandora's box that couldn't be closed. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself forever. At some point, I would have to tell Rachel what I had done, what I had discovered. But I didn't know how to do that without shattering whatever fragile foundation we still had left. More than anything, I worried about Caleb. Did he need to know? Would it help him to understand the truth, or would it only confuse and hurt him? These questions swirled in my mind, unanswered and unrelenting. By the time the sun rose, I had made one decision. I wasn't going to let this destroy my relationship with Caleb. He was my son, my family, and that was something no DNA test could take away. But the road ahead still felt uncertain, filled with choices I wasn't sure how to make. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I had aged a decade overnight. The weight of the paternity results pressed heavily on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I had decided I couldn't carry this secret alone anymore, even though I dreaded what came next. It was time to confront Rachel. I waited until the kids were busy with their Saturday morning cartoons. Their laughter drifted from the living room, a sharp contrast to the storm brewing inside me. Rachel was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters. She looked up when I entered, her expression guarded. I couldn't bring myself to sit down. My body felt too restless, like a coiled spring ready to snap. I stood by the doorway, my arms crossed, as I took a deep breath and began. I told her about the test, how I had ordered it, how I had collected the samples, and what the results had revealed. I left out nothing. Rachel froze, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. I could see her chest rising and falling rapidly, her mind scrambling for words. When she finally spoke, her voice was trembling, almost a whisper. She didn't deny it. Instead, she admitted that she had known all along. Hearing that nearly knocked the wind out of me. She knew? She had carried this secret for years, through birthdays and holidays, through sleepless nights with Caleb as a baby, and through every moment that I had poured my heart into being his father. She told me that Caleb's conception had been the result of a brief, reckless mistake during a rough patch in our marriage. At the time, she didn't think it was worth confessing. She believed it would only hurt me, and when Caleb was born, she convinced herself that he was mine in every way that mattered. Her words felt like salt in an open wound. I didn't know whether to scream, cry, or walk away. How could she have kept something so monumental from me for so long? And yet, as angry and betrayed as I felt, I couldn't ignore the flicker of pain in her eyes, the regret, the guilt, the fear of what might happen now. But this wasn't just about Rachel and me. It was about Caleb. I asked her if she had ever considered telling him the truth, but she shook her head. To her, Caleb was my son, and she never wanted to risk complicating his understanding of his place in our family. I couldn't argue with that. Caleb didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this mess. He had grown up with me as his dad, and in his heart, that's who I was. But knowing the truth about his biology added a layer of complexity I wasn't sure how to navigate. The rest of the day was tense and silent. Rachel and I avoided each other, retreating to separate corners of the house. I spent hours in the backyard, staring at the fence and trying to piece together what this all meant for us as a family. When the kids were asleep that night, Rachel approached me. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She asked me what I wanted to do. If I wanted to leave, if I wanted to tell Caleb, if I could even see a future for us anymore. I didn't have an answer for her, not yet. Part of me wanted to pack a bag and walk away, to let her deal with the fallout of her choices. But another part of me, maybe the larger part, kept thinking about Mia and Caleb. They didn't ask for any of this, and they deserved better than to see their family fall apart over something they had no control over. As much as I hated what Rachel had done, I couldn't ignore the years we had spent building a life together. She had made a terrible mistake, yes, but she had also been a loving mother and partner in countless ways. And Caleb, he was still my boy, regardless of biology. That night, I told Rachel that I needed time. I couldn't make any decisions in the heat of the moment, not when so much was at stake. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and said she would wait for as long as it took. The following weeks were some of the hardest of my life. I threw myself into work, into spending time with the kids, into anything that could distract me from the turmoil in my heart. But every quiet moment brought the same questions back to the forefront. Could I forgive Rachel? Could we move past this? And what would it mean for Caleb if the truth ever came out? Eventually, I realized that I couldn't make these decisions alone. I reached out to a therapist, someone who could help me untangle the mess of emotions and guide me toward clarity. The sessions were tough, grueling, even, but they helped me see the situation from angles I hadn't considered. One thing became clear. Whatever path I chose, it had to prioritize the well-being of my kids. They were innocent in all of this, and their happiness and stability mattered more than my anger or pride. By the end of the month, I knew what I needed to do. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way forward that felt true to who I was and the father I wanted to be. After weeks of soul-searching, I finally reached a place where I could make a decision. It wasn't about erasing the pain or pretending the betrayal hadn't happened. It was about figuring out what mattered most to me and what kind of future I wanted to build for myself and my family. First, I decided that Caleb would never know about the DNA test, at least not now. He was too young to understand the implications, and introducing such a complicated truth into his life felt more harmful than helpful. To him, I was his dad, and that was the role I would continue to play. Biology didn't define our bond. Years of love, care, and shared experiences did. As for Rachel, I couldn't just sweep her betrayal under the rug, but I also couldn't deny that I still loved her. The anger and hurt hadn't gone away, but neither had the memories of the life we had built together. The laughter, the support, the moments of joy that had defined so much of our marriage. So, I proposed that we go to couples counseling. I told Rachel that if we were going to try to rebuild, it would take effort from both of us. She agreed without hesitation. She said she'd do whatever it took to regain my trust and repair the damage she had caused. The counseling sessions were hard. Sitting in a room and unpacking years of unspoken resentment, disappointment, and pain felt like reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. But it was also cathartic. For the first time in years, we were honest with each other in a way we hadn't been before. Rachel apologized countless times, but what mattered more to me was her willingness to listen, to truly hear how her choices had affected me and to take responsibility for them. She didn't make excuses. She didn't try to shift the blame. She owned her mistakes, and that was a start. I also had to confront my own role in our marital struggles. While I hadn't betrayed her, I realized that I had been emotionally distant at times, so wrapped up in work and the daily grind that I had failed to notice the cracks forming in our relationship. It didn't justify what she had done, but it helped me see how we had both contributed to the distance between us. At home, I made a conscious effort to be more present with the kids. I took Caleb fishing for the first time, just the two of us. Watching his face light up when he caught his first fish reminded me of why I had chosen to stay. Mia and Caleb needed stability, and I wanted to be the father they could rely on, no matter what. Rachel and I started having weekly date nights, something we hadn't done in years. They weren't always smooth. There were awkward silences and moments of tension, but they were a step toward reconnecting. Slowly, I began to see glimpses of the woman I had fallen in love with, the partner I had chosen to build a life with. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Trust doesn't magically reappear overnight, and there are still days when the weight of what happened feels almost unbearable. But we're trying, and for now, that's enough. Through this experience, I've learned that forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook. It's about choosing to let go of the anger and resentment that can consume you if you let it. It's about acknowledging that people make mistakes, sometimes terrible ones, and deciding whether those mistakes define them or you. As for my family, we're still a work in progress. But as I watch Mia and Caleb playing together in the backyard, their laughter echoing through the air, I know I made the right choice for me. My love for them hasn't wavered, and in the end, that love is what keeps me moving forward.